The fluorescent lights of the 47th floor cast a cold, sterile glow across the marble reception area of Titanix Industries, one of the largest tech corporations in North America. It was the kind of building where every surface gleamed, where every employee wore tailored suits and designer heels, and where the air itself seemed to hum with the weight of millions of dollars exchanging hands every hour. Through the towering glass windows, the city of Seattle sprawled below like a circuit board, pulsing with life and ambition. But on this particular Tuesday morning, nobody walking through those polished halls could have predicted that the most extraordinary moment in the company's history was about to unfold in the executive suite, triggered by nothing more than a broken computer and a quiet man with a mop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. James Miller pushed his cleaning cart down the executive corridor, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. At 46 years old, his shoulders carried the weight of invisible burdens that most people in this building could never understand. His navy blue janitor's uniform was clean but faded from years of washing, his work boots scuffed and worn at the heels. A few strands of gray had begun threading through his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and worries that extended far beyond the walls of Titanix Industries. He had been working as a janitor at the company for almost 3 years now, arriving every morning at 5:30 to clean the executive floors before the high-powered employees streamed in with their lattes and their briefcases. Most days, he was invisible to them. They would walk past him without a glance, stepping around his mop bucket as if it were merely another piece of furniture. He had grown accustomed to the invisibility, had even come to prefer it. Being unseen meant being safe, meant avoiding questions he wasn't ready to answer. James paused at the water fountain near the executive suite, wiping down the chrome fixture with methodical care. Through the partially open door of the corner office, he could hear Victoria Chen's voice, sharp with frustration, speaking to someone through her intercom. He recognized that tone. It was the same tone she used when quarterly reports disappointed her, when employees failed to meet her impossibly high standards, when the world refused to bend to her will. Victoria Chen was a legend in the tech world, a self-made billionaire who had built her empire through sheer determination and ruthless efficiency. Her photo hung in the lobby downstairs, positioned prominently beside the company's mission statement. She was beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that came from expensive salons and personal trainers, her dark hair always styled perfectly, her designer suits tailored to perfection. But James had observed over the years that her eyes rarely held warmth, and her smiles never quite reached beyond her perfectly painted lips. He continued his work, spraying cleaner on the glass doors that separated the executive suite from the rest of the floor. As he wiped them down in smooth, circular motions, he caught fragments of Victoria's increasingly agitated conversation. Her computer had crashed. IT was delayed. She had a critical board meeting in less than an hour. The presentation that could secure a $300 million merger was trapped inside a frozen machine. James kept his head down, focusing on removing a stubborn smudge from the glass. He had learned long ago not to involve himself in the problems of executives. Their world and his world existed in parallel lines that never intersected, separated by barriers far more substantial than the glass he was currently cleaning. But then Victoria's office door swung open with such force that it nearly hit him. She stood in the doorway, her face flushed with anger, her perfectly manicured hand still gripping the door handle. Her eyes swept past James initially, looking for anyone who might be able to solve her problem. Then her gaze returned to him, and for the first time in 3 years, Victoria Chen actually looked directly at James Miller. "You," she said, her tone carrying the assumption that he would respond immediately to being addressed without a name. James straightened up, his spray bottle still in hand. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was quiet, respectful, giving nothing away. Victoria's eyes traveled over his uniform, his cleaning cart, the mop leaning against the wall. A strange expression crossed her face, something between desperation and amusement, as if an absurd idea had just occurred to her. "Do you know anything about computers?" The question hung in the air between them, and James could hear the underlying tone. She wasn't actually asking for help. She was so frustrated that she was making a joke at his expense, reaching the point where she would rather ask the janitor than wait another minute for proper IT support. James hesitated. The careful walls he had built around his past, around his old life, suddenly felt precarious. "I know a little bit," he said carefully, keeping his expression neutral. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the laugh of someone who had run out of options and had decided to embrace the absurdity of the situation. "A little bit," she repeated, shaking her head. "Well, that makes you overqualified compared to my current situation. Come on then. Let's see what the janitor can do." She turned and walked back into her office, leaving the door open and a clear command for him to follow. James glanced down the empty corridor, then at his cleaning cart. Every instinct told him to decline politely, to explain that he needed to finish his work, to maintain the invisible boundary between his world and hers. But something in her voice, beneath the sarcasm and frustration, reminded him of desperation. He recognized it because he had lived with that feeling for years. He parked his cart against the wall and followed her into the office. The space was enormous, easily 4 times the size of the studio apartment he shared with his daughter. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Abstract art that probably cost more than he made in a year hung on the walls. The desk itself was a masterpiece of design, all clean lines and expensive wood, and behind it sat the frozen computer, its screen displaying a presentation stuck mid-sentence. Victoria gestured toward the monitor with an exaggerated sweep of her hand. "There you go. Work your magic, janitor." Her assistant, Caroline, had followed them into the office and now stood near the doorway, her expression uncomfortable. She was one of the few employees who occasionally acknowledged James with a polite nod in the mornings. Now she looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, witnessing her boss humiliate an employee for entertainment. James approached the desk slowly, aware that Victoria was watching him with an expression that mixed skepticism and amusement. He could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck, but he kept his face calm. He had endured worse humiliations than this. Much worse. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the keyboard. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Be my guest. I'm sure you'll fix it right up." Her tone made it clear she expected him to fail, that this entire exercise was merely a way for her to vent her frustration while waiting for actual help to arrive. James pulled out the leather chair and sat down, his worn work boots looking out of place against the plush carpet beneath the desk. He studied the screen for a moment, taking in the error message displayed in the corner, the way the cursor had frozen mid-movement, the subtle signs that told him exactly what had gone wrong. His fingers moved to the keyboard, and for the first time in 3 years, James allowed himself to slip back into the person he used to be. He pressed a series of keys in rapid succession, combinations that bypassed the frozen interface and accessed the computer's core functions. Behind him, Victoria's phone buzzed, but she ignored it, her attention now fixed on the janitor who was typing with unexpected confidence. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone shifting slightly from mockery to curiosity. James didn't look up from the screen. "Your presentation software crashed because of a memory leak in one of your background applications. It's forcing a buffer overflow that's locking up your entire system. I'm accessing the task manager through an alternative route to close the problematic process without losing your unsaved work." The words came out automatically, the technical language flowing from him as naturally as breathing. He didn't realize what he had revealed until he heard the silence behind him. He glanced back to see Victoria staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, her earlier amusement completely gone. Caroline had taken a step forward, her eyes wide. James turned back to the computer, his heart rate accelerating. He had made a mistake. He had let his guard down. But it was too late to take it back now, so he continued working, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years doing far more than mopping floors. Within 2 minutes, the frozen screen flickered, the error message disappeared, and the presentation resumed normal function. He quickly saved the file, created a backup copy, and cleared the cache that had been causing the problem. "There," he said quietly, standing up from the chair. "Your presentation is recovered. I've also fixed the underlying issue so it shouldn't crash again." He stepped back from the desk, ready to retreat to the safety of his cart and his mop, to return to being invisible. But Victoria didn't move aside. She stood between him and the door, her sharp eyes studying him with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Who are you?" she asked, and this time there was no sarcasm in her voice, only genuine confusion. James swallowed hard. "I'm James Miller. I work in custodial services. I've been cleaning this floor for 3 years." Victoria shook her head slowly. "No. I mean, who are you really? Because janitors don't talk about buffer overflows and memory leaks. They don't access task managers through alternative routes. They don't fix in 2 minutes what my IT department can't handle in 30. Her voice grew sharper. "So I'm going to ask you again. Who are you?" James felt the walls closing in around him, the carefully constructed life he had built over the past 3 years threatening to crumble with every passing second. Victoria Chen stood between him and the door, her arms crossed, waiting for an answer that he had sworn he would never give to anyone in this building. Caroline hovered near the doorway, her curiosity evident despite her attempts to appear professionally detached. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second feeling like an eternity. He could lie. He had become skilled at evasion over the years, at deflecting questions with vague answers that satisfied without revealing. But something about the directness in Victoria's eyes, the way she had shifted from mockery to genuine interest, made him realize that a simple deflection would no longer work. She was the kind of person who dug until she found what she was looking for, and now he had given her a reason to dig. "I used to work in tech," James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a long time ago." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "Used to work in tech. That's quite a downgrade from fixing complex software issues to mopping floors. What happened? Did you get fired? Blacklisted?" The questions came rapid fire, each one feeling like a small cut. James looked down at his worn boots, at the cleaning supplies clipped to his belt, at the visible evidence of how far he had fallen. "It's complicated," he said, hoping that would be enough to end the conversation. But Victoria took a step closer, her expensive perfume cutting through the faint smell of cleaning solution that clung to his uniform. "I have 15 minutes before my board meeting," she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request but a command. "So uncomplicated for me. Tell me why someone with your obvious skills is working as a janitor in my building instead of sitting in one of those offices out there making 6 figures. James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he experienced whenever memories of his old life threatened to surface. He had spent 3 years running from those memories, burying them beneath the routine of early mornings and empty hallways, of being no one and nothing to anyone. But now, standing in this opulent office with a billionaire demanding answers, he realized that the past had finally caught up with him. "My daughter got sick," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. 5 years ago. Lily was only 8 years old when the doctors diagnosed her with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. James paused, the memory of that day still as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The sterile hospital room, the way the oncologist's words had seemed to come from very far away, the feeling of his entire world tilting on its axis. Victoria's expression softened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep talking even though every instinct screamed at him to stop, to maintain his privacy, to protect what little dignity he had left. "At the time, I was the chief technology officer at NextPoint Systems in San Francisco," he continued, each word feeling like a confession. "We were developing cutting-edge cybersecurity software for financial institutions. I had a team of 40 engineers under me. I made $300,000 a year, had stock options, a house in Palo Alto, a BMW in the garage. On paper, I had everything." Caroline gasped softly from the doorway, and Victoria's eyes widened with recognition. NextPoint Systems. I know that company. They were acquired by Morrison Tech 3 years ago for over $1 billion. James nodded slowly. They were. But I wasn't there to see it happen. The treatment for Lily's cancer was aggressive and expensive. Even with insurance, the costs mounted quickly. Experimental treatments, specialist consultations, medications that weren't fully covered. James could still remember the stacks of medical bills that had accumulated on the kitchen table, each one representing another piece of their financial stability crumbling away. My wife, Rachel, she couldn't handle it. The stress, the uncertainty, watching our daughter suffer through chemotherapy. 6 months after the diagnosis, she left. Just packed her bags one night while Lily was sleeping and walked out. I haven't heard from her since. Victoria's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness completely evaporated. James kept talking, the words flowing now like water through a broken dam. I threw myself into Lily's care. I took time off work, used all my vacation days, all my sick leave. My boss was understanding at first, but after a while, the absences became a problem. I missed important meetings, couldn't travel for conferences, had to leave early for doctor's appointments. The company needed a CTO who could be there full-time, and I couldn't be that person anymore. He remembered the day his boss had called him into the office, the awkward conversation about priorities and commitments, the suggestion that perhaps he should consider stepping down temporarily until his personal situation stabilized. James had known what that meant. In the tech industry, stepping down was career suicide. There was always someone younger, hungrier, more available waiting to take your place. So I resigned, James said. I told myself it was temporary, that once Lily went into remission, I could find another position, maybe something with better hours, more flexibility. But the medical bills kept coming. We lost the house. I burned through my savings, my retirement accounts, everything. I sold the car, the furniture, anything of value. We moved into a small apartment, then a smaller one. I applied for positions in my field, but 3 years is a lifetime in tech. My skills were outdated, my network had moved on, and every interview ended the same way. They wanted someone without baggage, without gaps in their resume, without a sick child at home. The bitterness in his voice surprised even himself. He had worked so hard to let go of that bitterness, to accept his circumstances without resentment. But speaking the truth aloud after years of silence brought it all rushing back, the anger at the unfairness of it all, the helplessness of watching everything he had built disappear. Victoria walked slowly to her desk and sat down in the chair James had just vacated, her perfectly composed exterior finally showing cracks. "How is your daughter now?" she asked, her voice gentler than he had ever heard it. James felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile he had managed in this entire painful conversation. "She's in remission. Has been for 2 years now. She's 13 years old, gets straight A's in school, wants to be a marine biologist. She's the reason I get up every morning." He thought of Lily as he had left her that morning, still sleepy as she ate her cereal before school, her hair grown back thick and beautiful after years of being lost to chemotherapy. She was his miracle, his reason for enduring jobs that felt beneath him, for swallowing his pride day after day, for accepting invisibility as a fair price for her survival. "But why here?" Victoria asked, gesturing around the office. "Why work as a janitor when you have the skills to do so much more?" James met her eyes directly for the first time since he had started talking. "Because custodial work pays the bills and doesn't ask questions. Because I can work early morning shifts and be home when Lily gets out of school. Because no one expects anything from the janitor except clean floors and empty trash cans. I don't have to explain gaps in my resume or why I left my last position. I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not anymore. I can just exist, take care of my daughter, and not worry about impressing anyone or living up to impossible standards." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Caroline had moved fully into the office now, no longer pretending to maintain professional distance. Outside the windows, Seattle continued its busy Tuesday morning, oblivious to the small drama unfolding 47 floors above the streets. "Do you know who I am?" Victoria asked suddenly, the question seeming to come from nowhere. James blinked, confused by the shift. "You're Victoria Chen, CEO of Titanix Industries. Everyone knows who you are." Victoria shook her head slowly. "No. I mean, do you know my story? Where I came from?" James admitted he didn't, beyond what was common knowledge from magazine profiles and business articles. Victoria stood up and walked to the windows, her back to him as she looked out over the city. "My parents immigrated from Taiwan with nothing. My father worked 3 jobs, my mother cleaned houses. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were normal background noise. I wore the same pair of shoes for 3 years because we couldn't afford new ones. When I told my high school counselor I wanted to go to MIT, she laughed and suggested I consider community college instead." She turned back to face James, and he was startled to see moisture in her eyes. "I built this company from nothing because I knew what it meant to have nothing. I worked 100-hour weeks, slept in my office, ate ramen noodles for dinner because I was too broke and too busy for anything else. I sacrificed relationships, health, any semblance of a normal life because I was terrified of ending up back where I started. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what that fear felt like. I forgot what it meant to struggle, to have to choose between pride and survival." James stood perfectly still, unsure where this confession was leading. Victoria walked back toward him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "You fixed my computer in 2 minutes. My entire IT department couldn't do that. Do you know why?" James shook his head. "Because they're trained to follow protocols and procedures. They run diagnostics, check standard issues, escalate when something falls outside their script. But you understood the actual problem instantly. You didn't need protocols because you have real expertise, years of experience that can't be taught in training seminars." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the determination hardening in her eyes. "I need someone like you. Not on my custodial staff, James. On my executive team." James felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Miss Chen, I appreciate the sentiment, but I can't. I have responsibilities, my daughter, my schedule." Victoria held up a hand. "Hear me out. Our Chief Information Security Officer is retiring in 3 months. I've been struggling to find a replacement, someone with real-world experience, someone who can think beyond textbook solutions. Every candidate my recruiters bring me is impressive on paper but useless in practice. You just demonstrated more practical knowledge in 5 minutes than most of them have shown in hours of interviews." James felt panic rising in his chest. This was too much, too fast. He had carefully constructed his small, safe life, and now this woman was threatening to upend everything. "I've been out of the field for years. My knowledge is outdated. I don't have the credentials anymore." These were all excuses, and they both knew it. Technology changed rapidly, but fundamental principles remained constant, and James had always been the type who understood those principles at a level that transcended specific programming languages or temporary trends. Victoria crossed her arms, studying him with that intense focus that had built her empire. "I'm not offering you charity, James. I'm offering you a job because I need what you can do. Yes, you'll have to update your knowledge, learn our systems, prove yourself. But I'm willing to invest in that if you're willing to try. The salary would start at $250,000, with full benefits, stock options, and flexible hours so you can still be there for your daughter." The number hit James like a physical blow. $250,000. More money than he had seen in years, enough to move out of their cramped apartment, to give Lily opportunities he had thought were lost forever, to stop living in constant fear of the next unexpected expense. But with that money came exposure, expectations, the risk of failing publicly after years of invisible safety. "I need to think about it," he said, his voice hoarse. Victoria nodded. "You have until the end of the week. But James, whatever you decide, thank you. For fixing my computer, yes, but more importantly for reminding me that talent and value aren't always packaged the way we expect them to be. I spent 10 minutes mocking you before I bothered to see who you actually were. That's inexcusable, and I apologize. The apology caught James off guard more than anything else that had happened. In his experience, people like Victoria Chen didn't apologize to people like him. The hierarchies were too entrenched, the power dynamics too unequal. Yet here she was, this billionaire CEO, offering genuine contrition to her janitor. Caroline stepped forward, glancing at her watch. Miss Chen, you have 5 minutes before the board meeting. Victoria straightened her shoulders, her professional mask sliding back into place. Right. Thank you, Caroline. She looked at James one more time. Think about my offer. Really think about it. Sometimes the universe gives us second chances when we least expect them. The question is whether we're brave enough to take them. James nodded wordlessly and left the office, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He returned to his cleaning cart in the hallway, gripping the handle tightly as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. Through the glass walls, he could see Victoria gathering her materials for the meeting, once again the composed, powerful executive who commanded rooms full of investors. But everything had changed. The invisible man had been seen, and there was no going back to the comfortable anonymity he had cultivated for 3 years. As James pushed his cart toward the elevator, his mind raced with possibilities and fears, with the terrifying prospect of hope after so long without it. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur for James. His hands went through the familiar motions of his work, wiping down surfaces, emptying waste bins, restocking supplies in the bathrooms, but his mind was elsewhere, spinning through the impossible conversation that had taken place in Victoria Chen's office. He kept replaying her words, the job offer that seemed too good to be real, the salary that represented not just financial security but a return to the life he thought he had lost forever. By the time his shift ended at 2 in the afternoon, James had convinced himself a dozen times to accept the offer and talked himself out of it just as many times. The familiar weight of fear sat heavy in his chest as he changed out of his uniform in the employee locker room, carefully hanging it up for tomorrow's shift. What if he took the job and failed? What if his skills really were too outdated, his knowledge too rusty? The humiliation of being fired from an executive position would be far worse than the quiet dignity of honest custodial work. He picked up Lily from school as he did every day, his old Honda Civic rattling as it pulled up to the curb outside Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. She bounced into the passenger seat, her backpack nearly as big as she was, her face lit up with the energy that only 13-year-olds seemed to possess in endless supply. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore the jacket he had bought her from the thrift store last month, the one she had insisted was perfect despite the slightly frayed cuffs. "How was your day, Dad?" she asked, buckling her seatbelt as James pulled back into traffic. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, and he squinted against the glare. "It was interesting," he said carefully, not quite ready to tell her about Victoria's offer. "How about yours? Did you finish that science project?" Lily launched into an enthusiastic description of her marine biology presentation, complete with hand gestures that nearly knocked her water bottle out of the cup holder. She talked about ocean currents and coral reef ecosystems with the same passion James had once brought to discussions of network security protocols and encryption algorithms. Listening to her, he felt the familiar ache of love mixed with guilt. She deserved so much more than their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, more than thrift store clothes and worries about whether they could afford the field trip fee or the new textbooks. That evening, after Lily had finished her homework and retreated to her room to video chat with friends, James sat at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The apartment was quiet except for the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below and the occasional laugh from Lily's room. He pulled out his old laptop, the one he had managed to hold onto through all the downsizing and selling off of possessions, and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing, searching for information about Titanix Industries' current projects, their security infrastructure, the challenges they were facing in the market. The articles and reports loaded slowly on his outdated machine, but as James read, he felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. It was the thrill of a complex problem waiting to be solved, the intellectual challenge that had once driven him to work those 100-hour weeks, to push the boundaries of what was possible in cybersecurity. Titanix was developing a new platform for encrypted communications that would revolutionize how corporations handled sensitive data. But they had been plagued by security breaches, minor ones so far, but enough to make investors nervous and competitors confident. James could see the vulnerabilities in their approach just from reading the technical specifications published in trade journals. He found himself mentally redesigning their architecture, identifying the weak points, mapping out solutions with the same instinctive understanding that had made him valuable at NextPoint all those years ago. He worked late into the night, lost in research and analysis, until he realized with a start that it was past midnight. When he finally closed the laptop, his coffee was ice cold and his neck was stiff from hunching over the small screen, but he felt more alive than he had in 3 years. The fear was still there, coiled tight in his stomach, but it was now accompanied by something else. Possibility. The next morning, James arrived at Titanix Industries at his usual time, 5:30, when the building was still mostly empty and the city outside was just beginning to wake. He went through his routine with mechanical precision, but his mind kept drifting back to Victoria's office, to the job offer that hung in the air like a question he couldn't avoid. By 8 o'clock, when the executive floor began filling with employees, James had made his decision, though he wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. He waited until 9, when he knew Victoria would be in her office, then approached her assistant's desk with his heart hammering against his ribs. Caroline looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from professional politeness to recognition when she saw him. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice warm. "Are you here to see Miss Chen?" James nodded, not trusting his voice. Caroline picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it, then looked back at him with a smile. "She'll see you now. Go right in." Victoria was standing by her windows when James entered, her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed quarterly projections with someone who was apparently not meeting expectations. She gestured for James to sit, wrapping up the call with a crispness that left no room for argument on the other end. When she hung up and turned to face him, her expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Have you made a decision?" she asked, moving to sit behind her desk. The morning light caught the sharp angles of her face, and James was struck again by how young she was to have accomplished so much. He had spent 3 years invisible to her, and now here he sat, about to change the trajectory of his life based on a conversation that had lasted less than an hour. "I have some conditions," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, but she gestured for him to continue. "I need to maintain my current schedule for the first 3 months. Early mornings so I can still pick up my daughter from school. I know that's not typical for an executive position, but Lily has to come first. If that's not possible, then I can't accept." Victoria nodded slowly. "That's reasonable. What else?" James took a deep breath. "I want it in writing that my employment isn't contingent on my medical history or my daughter's health situation. If she has a relapse, if I need to take time for appointments or treatments, I won't be penalized or pressured to choose between her and the job. I've made that choice before, and I'll make it the same way again, but I'd rather know up front if that's going to be a problem." The words came out harder than he intended, edged with the bitterness of past betrayals and broken promises. Victoria's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "James, I meant what I said about flexible hours. Family emergencies are not grounds for termination or discipline at Titanix. I'll have my lawyers draft an employment contract that explicitly protects your rights as a parent. If your daughter needs you, you go. No questions, no penalties. We'll figure out the work around your life, not the other way around." Something tight in James's chest loosened slightly. He had expected pushback, corporate doublespeak, the kind of empty assurances that evaporated the moment they became inconvenient. But Victoria spoke with a directness that suggested she meant every word. "There's one more thing," he said. "I need time to update my skills, to learn your systems without the expectation that I'll be performing at senior level immediately. I'm good at what I do, but I'm not current, and I won't pretend otherwise." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "That's exactly why I want to hire you. You're honest about your limitations. Half the people I interview oversell their abilities and underdeliver on results. You're doing the opposite." She stood up and extended her hand across the desk. "So do we have a deal, James Miller? Will you join Titanix Industries as our new Chief Information Security Officer?" James stood as well, looking at her outstretched hand. This was the moment of commitment, the point of no return. Once he shook her hand, he would be stepping back into the world he had left behind, with all its pressures and expectations and risks. But he would also be giving Lily the future she deserved, the opportunities he had thought were lost forever. He reached out and gripped Victoria's hand firmly. "Yes," he said. "We have a deal." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of paperwork and meetings. Victoria's HR department scrambled to process his hire, expediting background checks and arranging for his transition from custodial staff to executive employee. James signed documents, provided information, answered questions from HR representatives who couldn't quite hide their confusion at seeing a janitor being promoted to the C-suite. By lunchtime, he had an office on the 48th floor, a company laptop that made his personal machine look like a museum piece, and a start date of the following Monday. But it was Wednesday afternoon when the real test came. Victoria had called an emergency meeting of her senior leadership team to address the ongoing security vulnerabilities that had been plaguing their new platform. James attended as an observer, sitting quietly at the far end of the conference table while men and women in expensive suits discussed technical solutions with a confidence that didn't quite match their understanding. The chief technology officer, a man named Brandon Wells who looked fresh out of graduate school despite his impressive title, was presenting his department's latest attempt to patch the security holes. He spoke rapidly, using jargon and acronyms that sounded impressive but revealed, to James's trained ear, a fundamental misunderstanding of where the actual vulnerabilities existed. Brandon's solution would address the symptoms while leaving the disease untouched, buying them perhaps a few weeks before the next breach occurred. James listened in silence, his discomfort growing with each slide of the presentation. This wasn't his meeting, wasn't his place to speak. He was the new hire, the former janitor who hadn't even officially started yet. But as Brandon concluded his presentation and Victoria opened the floor for questions, James found himself unable to stay quiet. The stakes were too high, the solution too flawed, and his professional instincts too strong after years of being suppressed. He cleared his throat, and every head in the room turned toward him. Victoria's eyes met his, and he saw the subtle nod of encouragement. "That approach won't work," James said quietly. "You're treating the network like it's a fortress, trying to build higher walls around it. But the vulnerability isn't in your perimeter defenses. It's in your authentication protocols and your internal access hierarchies. You're not being breached from outside. Someone on the inside, whether intentionally or through compromised credentials, is opening doors you don't even know exist." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Brandon's face had gone red, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And you are?" James felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck, but he kept his voice steady. "James Miller. I'm joining as CISO next week. And before you dismiss what I'm saying, I'd suggest you run an audit of your admin access logs for the past 3 months. Pay special attention to credential usage during off hours, particularly between 2 and 4 a.m. I'm willing to bet you'll find multiple instances of elevated privileges being accessed from IP addresses that don't match your approved VPN endpoints." Victoria leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "Can you be more specific?" James pulled out the laptop Victoria had given him that morning, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. He had spent his lunch hour examining the public-facing aspects of Titanix's infrastructure, probing gently at the edges of their security without actually breaching anything. What he had found troubled him deeply. He turned the laptop so the screen faced the conference table. Your employee authentication system uses a dual-factor verification that's solid in theory but has a timing vulnerability in implementation. There's a window of approximately 0.3 seconds during the handshake between your authentication server and the user device where a sophisticated attacker could inject a session token. If someone has already compromised a legitimate user's credentials, they can exploit that window to bypass the second factor entirely. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's impossible. Our system was designed by one of the top security firms in the country. It's been tested and audited. James met his angry gaze calmly. Then your auditors missed it. It's a subtle vulnerability, easy to overlook if you're not specifically looking for timing-based attacks. But it's there, and if I found it in 2 hours of surface-level examination, you can bet that more motivated actors have found it too. Victoria's chief financial officer, a woman named Margaret Torres, spoke up from across the table. If what you're saying is true, how do we fix it? James closed the laptop and looked around the table at the assembled executives. You redesign the authentication handshake to eliminate the timing window. You implement additional logging and monitoring on all administrative access. You conduct a comprehensive audit of everyone who currently has elevated privileges and verify that those permissions are still necessary and appropriate. And you do all of this while assuming your network is already compromised, because based on what I've seen, it probably is. The room erupted in overlapping conversations, executives talking over each other, some defensive, others alarmed. Victoria let it continue for a moment before holding up her hand for silence. Brandon, I want that audit running by end of business today. Margaret, work with James to budget for the security overhaul he's describing. Everyone else, this meeting is now about damage control and prevention. We have 3 months before our platform launch, and I will not allow security concerns to derail years of development. She looked directly at James, and he saw respect in her eyes that hadn't been there even yesterday. James, it seems you've just started your job early. Welcome to Titanix Industries. The meeting continued for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted. James was no longer the silent observer but an active participant, answering technical questions, sketching out preliminary security architectures, demonstrating a depth of knowledge that gradually silenced even Brandon's hostility. By the time the meeting adjourned, James had effectively proven his value to every person in that room. As the executives filed out, Victoria caught his arm gently. That was impressive, she said quietly. But you made an enemy of Brandon in there. He's not going to forgive being corrected publicly, especially by someone he views as beneath him. James shrugged, exhaustion suddenly catching up with him. He'd been running on adrenaline for hours, and now that it was fading, he felt the weight of what he had just done. I didn't come here to make friends, he said. I came here to do a job. If Brandon's ego is more important than the security of this company, then he's in the wrong position. Victoria's smile was approving. That's the attitude that's going to take you far here. But be careful. Corporate politics can be just as dangerous as security breaches, and you've just painted a target on your back. James thought about his daughter waiting for him at school, about the cramped apartment and the life they had scraped together from the ruins of his old career. I've survived worse than office politics, he said. I'll manage. As he left the building that afternoon, his mind already racing with the work ahead, James realized that he had crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. He was no longer the invisible janitor, no longer the man who could hide from his past and his potential. Victoria Chen had seen him, really seen him, and in doing so had forced him to see himself again. Not as a victim of circumstance or a casualty of an unfair world, but as someone with value, with skills, with something to contribute beyond clean floors and empty trash cans. The fear was still there, probably would always be there. But for the first time in 3 years, it was accompanied by something stronger. Purpose. James's first official day as Chief Information Security Officer began at 6 a.m. on a Monday that felt simultaneously like the beginning of everything and the end of the comfortable anonymity he had worn like armor for 3 years. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn since his Next Point days, the fabric feeling foreign against his neck after years of simple work uniforms. The suit was new, purchased over the weekend with money Victoria had advanced him against his first paycheck. It fit well enough, though James couldn't shake the feeling that he was wearing a costume, pretending to be someone he was no longer sure he knew how to be. Lily had been thrilled when he told her about the job offer, her excitement unburdened by the complicated emotions that kept James awake at night. She had thrown her arms around his neck and told him she was proud of him, that she always knew he was special even when he was just the janitor. Her words had cut deeper than she could know, a reminder of how much of his struggle he had successfully hidden from her, and how much she had understood anyway despite his best efforts at protection. Now, as he drove through the early morning streets of Seattle toward Titanix Industries, James felt his stomach churning with anxiety. The building loomed against the dawn sky, 48 floors of glass and steel that had once represented simply a place of employment and now symbolized something far more significant. A second chance. A return to relevance. A terrifying leap into a world that had once chewed him up and spit him out. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when James walked through the lobby. "Hey, aren't you the guy who used to clean the executive floors?" James managed a tight smile. "Used to be, yes. I'm starting in a different role today." The guard's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he checked his computer and issued James a new security badge without comment. The photo on the badge showed a man who looked uncertain, caught between identities, neither janitor nor executive but something undefined in between. James's office was on the 48th floor, just down the hall from Victoria's suite. It was smaller than hers but still impossibly luxurious by the standards of his recent life. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Elliott Bay, the water glittering in the morning sun. A desk made of dark wood dominated the space, flanked by bookshelves that were currently empty but waiting to be filled. There were 2 monitors, a high-backed leather chair, and a small seating area with a couch and coffee table. On the desk sat a nameplate that read James Miller, Chief Information Security Officer, in crisp lettering that made his new reality undeniable. He set down his briefcase, an old one he had kept from his Next Point days, and stood at the window for a long moment. From this height, the city looked orderly and manageable, the morning traffic flowing like blood through arteries, the buildings standing like monuments to ambition and achievement. Somewhere down there, people were starting their days in jobs they hated, struggling to make ends meet, invisible to the successful people who passed them without a second glance. James had been one of those invisible people just days ago. Now he stood in an executive office, and the dizzying speed of the transformation left him feeling unmoored. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Victoria entered without waiting for a response, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a smile that seemed genuine rather than merely professional. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him one of the cups. "First days are always overwhelming, even for people who aren't making the jump you just made." James accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth of the cup grounding him slightly. "Thank you. For this, and for everything else. I'm still not entirely sure I'm not going to wake up and find out this was all some elaborate dream." Victoria leaned against his desk, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what happened last week. About how close I came to never knowing who you were, what you were capable of. It bothers me more than I can say. How many other people are walking through this building every day, invisible to us, carrying skills and stories we never bother to discover?" It was a rhetorical question, but James answered anyway. "More than you'd think. The world is full of people who had to make impossible choices, who got knocked down by circumstances and never quite managed to get back up. Most of them aren't as lucky as me. They don't get billionaire CEOs fixing their computers and offering them executive positions." Victoria's expression darkened slightly. "That's not luck, James. That's me almost making a terrible mistake. If your skills hadn't been so obviously relevant to my immediate problem, I would have laughed you out of my office and never given you another thought. That's a failing on my part, not good fortune on yours." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed with a calendar notification. His first meeting was in 15 minutes, a one-on-one with Brandon Wells to discuss the security audit results. Victoria noticed the change in his expression. "Brandon's going to make this difficult for you," she said. He sees you as a threat, and he's not entirely wrong. You embarrassed him in front of the leadership team. James set down his coffee cup, squaring his shoulders. I can handle Brandon. I've dealt with territorial CTOs before. They usually come around once they realize I'm there to make their lives easier, not harder. Victoria pushed off from the desk, heading toward the door. Just remember that you have my full support. Brandon is brilliant in his way, but brilliance without humility is a liability. If he pushes back on necessary changes because of ego, I need to know about it. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. And James? You belong here. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. The meeting with Brandon took place in a small conference room on the 47th floor. Brandon was already there when James arrived, his laptop open, his posture radiating defensive hostility. He didn't look up when James entered, his fingers continuing to move across his keyboard with deliberate focus. James took a seat across from him and waited, refusing to be intimidated by the childish power play. After nearly a minute of silence, Brandon finally closed his laptop and met James's eyes. The audit you requested found some irregularities, he said, his tone clipped and professional. Nothing as dramatic as you suggested, but enough to warrant further investigation. I've assigned a team to dig deeper into the access logs. His delivery made it clear he considered this a waste of resources, an overreaction to a problem that James had exaggerated for effect. James pulled out his own laptop and turned it so Brandon could see the screen. I ran my own analysis over the weekend, he said calmly. Using just the publicly available information about your network architecture and some basic penetration testing tools, I was able to map 17 different potential entry points into your system. 3 of them are critical vulnerabilities that could give an attacker complete administrative control. The others are less severe but still exploitable by anyone with moderate technical skills. Brandon's face had gone pale as he stared at the screen. James had prepared a detailed report, complete with diagrams and step-by-step explanations of how each vulnerability could be exploited. It was thorough, professional, and utterly damning of the current security posture that Brandon's team had assured Victoria was solid. You hacked our network, Brandon said, his voice rising slightly. That's illegal. James shook his head. I performed authorized security testing, which is explicitly part of my job description. I didn't actually breach anything or access any data. I simply identified the pathways someone else could use if they chose to. There's a significant difference. He leaned forward slightly, his voice hardening. And before you try to shoot the messenger, consider that I just gave you a roadmap for fixing problems that could have destroyed this company. Your platform launches in 3 months. If any of these vulnerabilities are exploited before or during that launch, Titanix will lose not just money but credibility. Victoria's reputation will take a hit. Investors will flee. All because you prioritized your pride over the security of this organization. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Brandon's jaw worked silently, emotions flickering across his face too quickly for James to identify them all. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. What do you want from me? James closed his laptop, his expression neutral. I want you to do your job without letting ego get in the way. I'm not here to replace you or undermine you, Brandon. I'm here to handle security so you can focus on development. But I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, even if my resume has some gaps in it. Brandon stood abruptly, gathering his laptop. I'll have my team start implementing your recommended fixes, he said stiffly. We'll need to coordinate timelines and resource allocation. James stood as well, extending his hand. I'm looking forward to working with you. Brandon looked at the offered hand for a long moment before shaking it briefly. His grip was perfunctory, his expression still guarded, but it was a start. As he left the conference room, James allowed himself a small exhale of relief. He had survived the first confrontation. There would be more, inevitably, but at least Brandon now understood that James was neither incompetent nor easily dismissed. The rest of the day was a marathon of meetings, introductions, and technical briefings. James met with the network operations team, the development team, the compliance officers, and the legal department. Each meeting brought new faces, new questions, and new evidence of how much work needed to be done to bring Titanix's security infrastructure up to acceptable standards. By 4 in the afternoon, James's head was swimming with information and his professional instincts were screaming warnings about vulnerabilities that needed immediate attention. He made it to the school just in time to pick up Lily, his tie loosened and his jacket tossed into the back seat. She climbed into the car with her usual energy, chattering about a pop quiz in English class and some drama with her friends at lunch. James listened with half his attention, the other half still processing everything he had learned throughout the day. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Lily fell silent, studying him with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of Victoria's penetrating gaze. "You're stressed," she said finally. It wasn't a question. James glanced at her, then back at the road. "New job jitters. It'll get easier once I settle in." Lily's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe him, but she was 13 and had learned when to push and when to let things go. "Just remember what Mom said before she left," Lily said quietly. "That you always worked too hard. That you forgot about us when you got caught up in your projects." The words hit James like a physical blow. He had thought Lily was too young to remember much about Rachel, about those final months before she left when the marriage had been crumbling under the weight of medical bills and impossible stress. But clearly, she had absorbed more than he realized. "I'm not going to forget about you," he said firmly. "You're the reason I took this job, Lily. Everything I do is for you." She reached over and squeezed his arm briefly, a gesture of reassurance that seemed too mature for her age. "I know, Dad. Just don't forget to live your life too, okay? Not just work and taking care of me. You deserve to be happy." The simple wisdom of her words settled over James like a blanket, warm and uncomfortable at the same time. When had his daughter become wise enough to worry about his happiness? When had she learned to see through his protective facades to the lonely man underneath? That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, James sat at his kitchen table with his work laptop open, reviewing the security audit in detail. The irregularities Brandon had mentioned were worse than he had let on. Someone had been accessing administrative systems using credentials that appeared legitimate but showed subtle anomalies in their usage patterns. The access times were odd, the commands executed were unusual, and the IP addresses, while routing through the company VPN, originated from geographic locations that didn't match any known employee. James created a detailed analysis, documenting each suspicious access event, tracing the patterns, building a profile of what was happening. By midnight, he had a working theory that made his blood run cold. Someone wasn't just probing Titanix's defenses. They had already established a persistent presence inside the network, moving carefully and quietly, extracting information in small amounts that wouldn't trigger automated alerts. It was sophisticated, professional, and suggested either industrial espionage or preparation for something far worse. He drafted an email to Victoria, laying out his findings in clear, direct language. This wasn't speculation or paranoia. This was a real and present threat that required immediate action. He hit send at 12:45 in the morning, then sat back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Victoria's response was brief but told him everything he needed to know. "My office, 7 a.m. Bring everything you have." James arrived at Victoria's office the next morning to find her already there, along with Brandon and Margaret Torres. The CFO looked tired, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, suggesting she had been up as late as James working through the implications of his findings. Brandon's expression was grim, his earlier hostility replaced by something that looked almost like respect, or at least acknowledgement that James might actually know what he was talking about. "Walk us through it," Victoria said without preamble. James connected his laptop to the conference room display and began presenting his analysis. He showed them the patterns he had identified, explained the significance of each anomaly, demonstrated how the pieces fit together to reveal a coordinated infiltration. The room was silent except for his voice and the occasional sound of someone shifting in their chair. When he finished, Margaret was the first to speak. How long has this been going on? James pulled up a timeline. Based on the earliest anomalous access I can identify, at least 4 months. Possibly longer if they were even more careful in the beginning. Brandon leaned forward, his technical expertise finally engaged despite his personal feelings about James. Can we identify who's behind it? James shook his head. Not yet. They're routing through multiple proxy servers and using sophisticated obfuscation techniques. But I can tell you this isn't some amateur hacker looking for credit card numbers. This is a professional operation, probably state-sponsored or corporate espionage. They're after your proprietary algorithms, your development roadmap, anything that would give a competitor an advantage. Victoria's expression had gone hard, the successful CEO replaced by the woman who had fought her way up from nothing and wouldn't tolerate threats to what she had built. What's our move? James had spent the remaining hours of the night after sending his email planning for exactly this question. We need to implement a honeypot system. We create a section of the network that looks like it contains valuable information but is actually isolated and monitored. We let the intruder access it, which will give us better tracking data and potentially help us identify who they are. Meanwhile, we quietly audit every employee with administrative access, looking for anyone who might have been compromised or who might be working with outside actors. Brandon nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the technical implications. That could work. But it's risky. If they realize we're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline or destroy evidence. James met his eyes directly. It's less risky than doing nothing and hoping they go away. They've been inside your network for months. They're not going to stop until they get what they came for or we force them out. Every day we wait gives them more time to steal your intellectual property. Margaret turned to Victoria. This is going to be expensive. We'll need to bring in additional security consultants, possibly law enforcement. And if word gets out that we've been breached, even if nothing was actually stolen, it could tank our stock price. Victoria stood, walking to the windows that overlooked the city. James watched her reflection in the glass, seeing the weight of leadership in the set of her shoulders. She was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was firm with decision. We do whatever James recommends. Cost is secondary to security. I built this company to last, not to cut corners when things get difficult. She turned back to face them. Brandon, you'll work directly with James on implementing the technical solutions. Margaret, prepare a contingency budget but keep the details compartmentalized. I don't want rumors spreading through the company. And James, she looked at him directly, her expression intense, you have carte blanche to do whatever you need to do. Hire whoever you need, access whatever systems are necessary, make whatever changes will keep us safe. I'm trusting you with the future of this company. The weight of that trust settled on James's shoulders like a physical burden. He had been Chief Information Security Officer for exactly 1 day, and already he was being asked to solve a crisis that could destroy everything Victoria had built. The part of him that was still the janitor, still the man who had learned to keep his head down and avoid responsibility, wanted to defer to someone with more recent experience, more current credentials, more right to make these critical decisions. But the part of him that had once been CTO of NextPoint Systems, that had led teams through complex technical challenges, that had built security architectures for some of the largest financial institutions in the country, recognized what was being offered. Not just trust, but redemption. A chance to prove that the years spent invisible hadn't erased who he fundamentally was. A chance to be valuable again, not despite his struggles but informed by them. I'll need a team, James said, his voice steady. At least 3 senior security engineers, access to outside consultants who specialize in forensic analysis, and authority to make changes to network architecture without requiring multiple levels of approval. Victoria nodded immediately. Done. Anything else? James thought of Lily, of the promise he had made not to let work consume him the way it had before. I need to maintain my schedule of picking up my daughter from school. That's non-negotiable, even if we're in crisis mode. I can work remotely in the evenings, but 3 to 4 p.m., I'm out. He waited for pushback, for the suggestion that executive positions required sacrifice, that crisis situations didn't respect personal boundaries. But Victoria simply nodded again. "We'll schedule critical meetings around that. Your daughter comes first. We'll make it work." Brandon looked like he wanted to object but caught Victoria's expression and wisely remained silent. Over the next 2 weeks, James threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that was both exhilarating and exhausting. He assembled a team of security specialists, brought in a forensic consultant from a firm that specialized in tracking sophisticated cyber intrusions, and implemented the honeypot system he had proposed. The team worked around the clock, though James stuck religiously to his promise about picking up Lily, making up the time in late-night sessions after she went to bed. The honeypot worked better than James had dared hope. Within 3 days of its deployment, the intruder took the bait, accessing what appeared to be a repository of Titanix's most sensitive development files. James's team traced the access in real time, mapping the route through various proxy servers, documenting every command executed, building a comprehensive picture of the threat. What they found was both better and worse than expected. The intrusion wasn't state-sponsored or corporate espionage from an external competitor. It was being conducted by someone inside Titanix, someone with legitimate administrative credentials who was selling company secrets to 3 different rival tech firms. The forensic evidence led to a senior network engineer named David Huang, a 10-year veteran of the company who had apparently become disillusioned and decided to monetize his access. The revelation sent shockwaves through the executive leadership. Victoria looked physically ill when James presented the evidence, the betrayal clearly hitting her harder than any external threat could have. David had been at her birthday celebration 2 years ago. She had personally approved his promotion to senior engineer. And all the while, he had been systematically stealing the company's future and selling it to the highest bidder. The decision to involve law enforcement was difficult but necessary. Federal agents arrested David at his home on a Thursday morning, seizing his computers and finding evidence of transfers totaling nearly $2 million from various shell companies linked to Titanix's competitors. The case would take months to fully prosecute, but the immediate threat was neutralized. James had delivered on Victoria's trust in him, proving his value in the most dramatic way possible. But the victory felt hollow to James as he sat in his office late that Thursday evening, the city lights glittering below him. He had saved Victoria's company, protected intellectual property worth hundreds of millions, and validated his return to the professional world he thought he had lost. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of David being led away in handcuffs, a man not much younger than James who had made terrible choices and would now pay a devastating price. How easily could that have been him? If circumstances had been slightly different, if desperation had pushed him just a little further, might James have been the one selling secrets to pay medical bills? The line between hero and villain felt distressingly thin, separated more by luck and opportunity than any fundamental moral superiority. Victoria found him there around 9 p.m., standing at his window as he had on his first day. "You should go home," she said gently. "Get some rest. You've earned it." James turned to face her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes that matched his own. "Did you know David well?" Victoria leaned against the door frame, her usual polish dimmed by the emotional toll of betrayal. "I thought I did. He seemed loyal, dedicated. Shows how much I really know about the people who work for me." James thought about his 3 years as an invisible janitor, about all the conversations he had overheard, the glimpses into lives he wasn't supposed to notice. "People are complicated," he said. "They make choices for reasons we can't always understand from the outside. That doesn't excuse what David did, but it reminds us that everyone has a story, circumstances that shape their decisions." Victoria studied him with that penetrating gaze he was becoming familiar with. "Is that what you tell yourself? To make sense of how far you fell?" The question was too perceptive, cutting too close to thoughts James preferred not to examine. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I'm just tired and philosophical. It's been an intense couple of weeks." Victoria pushed off from the door frame, walking to stand beside him at the window. "You did well, James. Better than well. You saved this company, and you did it with skills everyone told me were outdated. You proved that experience and wisdom matter more than whatever the latest trend in tech happens to be." James felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with professional pride and everything to do with being seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For taking a chance on the janitor who fixed your computer. For seeing something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself." Victoria smiled, and for once it reached her eyes. "Thank you for reminding me that the most valuable people aren't always the ones with the most impressive titles or the newest credentials. Sometimes they're pushing cleaning carts through our hallways, invisible until we bother to look." 6 months after James Miller walked into Victoria Chen's office as a janitor and walked out with a job offer that would change his life, Titanix Industries held its annual company gathering at a hotel ballroom in downtown Seattle. The event was meant to celebrate the successful launch of their encrypted communications platform, which had exceeded all projections and solidified Titanix's position as an industry leader. Employees from every department filled the space, from executives in tailored suits to custodial staff in their everyday clothes, all gathered to mark a milestone that belonged to everyone. James stood near the back of the room with Lily beside him, her dress carefully chosen from a store where they no longer had to check price tags before deciding. She was beaming with pride, her hand tucked into his as Victoria took the stage to address the crowd. The past 6 months had transformed their lives in ways that still felt surreal. They had moved into a 3-bedroom apartment with actual space and natural light. Lily was enrolled in a marine biology program for gifted students. James had paid off every medical bill that had haunted them for years. But more than the material changes, something fundamental had shifted in how James saw himself. He was no longer hiding from his past or his potential. The work was demanding and sometimes overwhelming, but he faced it with confidence rebuilt through Victoria's trust and his own proven capabilities. His team respected him. Brandon had become, if not a friend, then at least a genuine colleague who valued James's insights. The invisible man had found his voice again. Victoria's speech was gracious and inclusive, thanking departments by name and acknowledging the contributions that had made their success possible. Then she did something unexpected. She asked James to join her on stage. He felt Lily squeeze his hand encouragingly as he made his way through the crowd, conscious of hundreds of eyes following his path. When he reached the stage, Victoria turned to address the audience with an intensity that commanded complete attention. "Most of you know James Miller as our Chief Information Security Officer, the man who identified and stopped a major security breach that could have destroyed this company before our platform even launched. What many of you don't know is that 6 months ago, James was working as a janitor on our executive floors." Victoria paused, letting that information sink in. The room had gone completely silent. She continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "I almost never discovered who he really was, what he was capable of. I walked past him every day for 3 years without seeing him, without bothering to look beyond his uniform and his cleaning cart. It took my computer crashing in my own desperation for me to accidentally stumble onto the fact that I had someone extraordinary working in my building all along, invisible because I chose not to see him." James felt his throat tighten as Victoria turned to look at him directly. "James taught me one of the most important lessons of my career. That talent and value come in unexpected packages. That people's current circumstances don't define their potential. That everyone has a story, and we miss out on remarkable things when we don't bother to listen." She looked back at the audience. "So today, I'm announcing a new initiative at Titanix Industries. We're creating a program to identify employees at every level who might have skills or experiences we're not utilizing. We're going to actively look for the invisible people in our own organization and give them opportunities to grow, to contribute, to be seen." The applause started slowly and then built to a wave that filled the room. James saw members of the custodial staff in the back crying, saw young employees in entry-level positions sitting up straighter, saw hope kindle in faces that had been resigned to being overlooked. Victoria had just changed the culture of her company in a single speech, and she had used James's story to do it. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, James found himself surrounded by employees wanting to shake his hand, to hear his story, to tell him their own. A young woman from the mailroom confessed she had a degree in computer science but couldn't get hired in tech because she lacked connections. A security guard revealed he had been a mechanical engineer in his home country but his credentials weren't recognized in the United States. Story after story of invisible people carrying unused potential, suddenly feeling like they might be seen. Lily stayed close to his side through it all, her pride in her father evident in every smile and squeeze of his arm. When there was finally a break in the crowd, she looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom beyond her 13 years. "Mom would be proud of you," she said quietly. "Not for the job or the money. For not giving up on yourself even when things got really hard." James knelt down so he was eye level with his daughter, not caring that his expensive suit might wrinkle or that people might be watching. "Your mom left when things got difficult," he said gently. "But you stayed. You fought through being sick, through being scared, through years when we had almost nothing. If anyone should be proud, it's me. Of you. For being brave when I was barely holding it together." Lily hugged him tightly, and James held his daughter in the middle of that crowded ballroom, surrounded by the noise and celebration of success, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of challenges or the end of struggle, but the deep knowledge that he had weathered the worst and emerged not just intact but stronger. Victoria approached them as they separated, her expression warm. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she said to James. She gestured toward an older man standing nearby, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "This is Robert Chen, my father. He wanted to thank you personally." James shook the older man's hand, surprised by the strength in his grip despite his age. Robert's eyes were kind but assessing, taking James's measure in a glance. "My daughter tells me you saved her company," Robert said, his accent still carrying traces of Taiwan. "She also tells me you did it while making sure to pick up your daughter from school every day. That is the mark of a man who understands what truly matters." The simple approval from this man who had sacrificed so much for his own daughter's success meant more to James than any professional accolade. "We do what we have to do for our children," James said. Robert nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Yes. And sometimes our children surprise us by seeing things we have become too blind to notice. My daughter was so focused on building her empire that she almost missed the treasure walking through her halls every day. I am glad she did not make that mistake." As the evening wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, James and Lily made their way out to the parking lot. The Seattle night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. James's car was no longer the rattling Honda but a reliable sedan that started on the first try and had heat that actually worked. Small things, perhaps, but each one represented a return to stability that had once seemed impossibly distant. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep against the window, exhausted from the excitement of the evening. James glanced at her peaceful face in the rearview mirror and felt overwhelming gratitude for the chain of events that had led them here. A broken computer. A desperate CEO. A moment of visibility after years of being unseen. Such small things to hinge a life upon, yet here they were, transformed. When they arrived home, James carried Lily inside and tucked her into bed, something he hadn't been able to do since she was much younger and lighter. She stirred slightly, mumbling something about being proud of him before settling back into sleep. James stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing, seeing the healthy color in her cheeks that had been absent for so many years. Later, sitting in his own room with the lights of the city visible through his window, James opened his laptop one final time before bed. There was an email from Victoria, sent just an hour ago. He opened it to find a brief message that made him smile. "Thank you for letting me see you," it read. "And thank you for teaching me to see. Tomorrow we change more lives. The work continues. Victoria." James closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. The work did continue. There would be more challenges, more crises, more moments when his skills would be tested and his resolve questioned. But he would face them as himself, fully visible, no longer hiding behind the safety of invisibility. He had been given a second chance, not through luck or charity, but through someone choosing to look beyond surface appearances and see the person underneath. And perhaps that was the real lesson of his journey. That everyone deserved to be seen. That circumstances didn't define worth. That the janitor pushing a mop might be the person who saves your company, if only you bother to notice. That redemption wasn't about returning to who you used to be, but about becoming who you were always meant to be, shaped by both success and struggle into something stronger than either alone could create. James thought about the program Victoria had announced, about all the invisible people who would now have chances they never expected. His story had become their story, a reminder that transformation was possible, that being seen could change everything. He had gone from invisible to indispensable, from janitor to executive, from broken to whole. Not because the circumstances of his life had been easy, but because someone had chosen to look past his uniform and see his value. And in doing so, Victoria Chin had given him more than a job. She had given him back himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.